In the last video, we began to discuss metabolism, including anabolic reactions that build complex molecules from simpler ones, and catabolism, where we break down complex molecules into simpler ones and, as a main outcome of that, generate energy, typically in the form of ATP as the main energy storage molecule that is produced by the body. ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate. In this video, we focus on learning more about how ATP is able to provide energy for the vital functions of the cell. The amount of ATP that we generate and use per day is incredible. Literally every time we contract our muscles, every time a nerve signal transmits through the body, every time an enzyme is synthesized, and for a variety of other processes, we use the energy that is derived from ATP. In fact, within a single second, 1 to 2 million ATP molecules are used within your body. It's an incredible number. In fact, within an entire day, if we add all of that up, generally the amount of ATP that is used in a day is equal to about our body weight. Even though at any given time there's only 1 gram of ATP present in our body typically, that molecule is used and recycled over and over and over again throughout the day to power the plethora of different types of processes that our body requires energy for. Where do we get that energy from within this small ATP molecule? Looking at the structure, we can break it into 3 parts. The part here at the far left end of the molecule is the triphosphate group here, PO4, PO4, PO4. That triphosphate group is where the energy from ATP is derived because the breakage of each of these phosphate bonds here and here is highly exothermic, meaning that when that bond is broken, a tremendous amount of energy is released, and that energy can be used to power other processes within the cell. In addition to the 3 phosphate groups that give the designation triphosphate, the ATP molecule also has this group, a ribose. Recalling back to our carbohydrates chapter, ribose was one of the monosaccharides. So this 5-atom monosaccharide is required as a component of ATP that bonds to the triphosphate group. And then connected to ribose up here is the structure known as adenine. Adenine is an aromatic molecule. Aromatic molecules with this alternating pattern of single bond, double bond are generally incredibly stable, and this portion of the molecule is indeed quite durable and quite stable, in contrast to these 3 phosphate groups that will rapidly be hydrolyzed, meaning using water in a reaction to release one of the phosphate groups and generate energy, and then ultimately recycled back with a phosphate group being re-added and energy used for that process. We mentioned that the breakage of one or more of these high-energy phosphate bonds here in ATP through hydrolysis, that is a reaction where we react water with ATP, results in the release of a phosphate group as well as energy. That energy, in the form of kilocalories, is derived from the fact that this reaction is exothermic. Exothermic, by definition, means it releases heat, or otherwise known as energy. That energy is used to drive processes in the body that would otherwise be endothermic, hence unfavorable without the supply of this external energy provided by the energy that is released from breaking ATP into ADP and breaking that high energy phosphate bond. Some of the processes that this energy is used to enable include the synthesis of genetic materials, including a variety of macromolecules such as nucleic acids that comprise DNA, as well as the plethora of different proteins that are present within the body. Additionally, and overlapping to somewhat with that synthesis of macromolecules, is the synthesis of cellular components such as the various organelles that are present within a eukaryotic cell could not exist without the energy provided from ATP. The movement of muscles within any moment in the body, that is voluntary muscle movement and involuntary, such as the heart beating, derive their energy from ATP's hydrolysis reaction, releasing energy. The transport of molecules from inside the cell to outside the cell, or vice versa, relies on ATP as an energy source for that as well. For example, when the concentration of sodium is not correct within the cell, death of the entire organism can result, and it is a role of ATP to provide the energy that allows sodium to be transported into and out of the cell to maintain the cell in its happy equilibrium state. Finally, electrical energy, or nerve impulses within the cell and within the body, also use the energy from ATP to power those biochemical processes. Without ATP, literally any living thing would be dead within the matter of microseconds. Let's take a closer look now at how ATP provides energy for the cell, how much energy is provided via ATP, and how that energy is actually used. If we take a look here, starting at the top with the ATP molecule, the adenine group, the ribose group, and the triphosphate group, we learned previously that a hydrolysis reaction cleaves off one of these phosphate groups, and when that phosphate group is released, as we see here with the arrow leaving the cycle, that generates energy in the form of kilocalories. How much energy are we talking about here? Well, when we're referring to ATP reacting with water to yield ADP and releasing one phosphate group, that generates 7.3 kilocalories of energy per mole of ATP that is hydrolyzed. So we can write that out as an equation. That is ATP plus water, water being necessary for a hydrolysis reaction, because hydrolysis by definition uses water to break covalent bonds, results in the formation of ADP, adenosine diphosphate, missing that phosphate group. It also creates inorganic phosphate, which we abbreviate as PI, and it releases 7.3 kilocalories per mole of energy. So that's why I put plus 7.3 kcals per mole, showing that this is an exothermic reaction because energy appears on the product side of the equation. Now, I've shown this not just as a straight chemical reaction, but instead as a cycle here of ATP to ADP back and forth. So what happens toward the bottom part of this diagram and toward the left? Well, once ADP is produced and energy is generated, that ADP does not simply get thrown away by the cell. Instead, cells are pretty frugal characters, and so what the cell does is it actually recycles the ADP. How that process happens is that ADP reacts with a phosphate group to be transformed back into ATP. The energy needed for this process, since now we are creating a high energy bond rather than breaking that high energy bond, the energy necessary for that process is derived from the food and nutrients that we consume and the biochemical processes by which those are converted into energy. So during the process of digestion and degradation of foods, and once those molecules enter things like the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, those biochemical processes are what enable phosphate to be reattached to ADP, energy used by that reaction, so that's an endothermic reaction, and that regenerates ATP to then start the process over again. And it is this cycle of ATP being converted to ADP back and forth, that is why at any one time in the body, there's typically only about 1 gram of ATP present, but during the day, so much of that is used and recycled through this cycle that over the course of a day, we generate and use our entire body weight of ATP. And much like we wrote out when converting ATP and water into ADP and inorganic phosphate, how energy appears on the product side, when we look at this reverse process of converting ADP back to ATP, we can write a similar equation, except this time ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is our reactant, plus inorganic phosphate, PI for inorganic phosphate, and then in order for this reaction to take place and generate ATP, we need an input of 7.3 kilocalories per mole of energy provided through that catabolic processes to ultimately generate ATP to begin the cycle again. For this reason, with the energy here being on the reactant side of the equation, that tells us that this particular reaction is endothermic rather than exothermic. Requires the input of energy in order for the process to take place, and that energy is derived from the breakdown of the foods that we consume. Let's apply the information that we've just looked at toward a more real-world problem of understanding how ATP links to the number of calories. And when we say calories on food labeling, we typically are referring to actually kilocalories. So here, when I use the term connecting ATP and calories, what we're really referring to is kilocalories. So a person burns 600 kilocalories, and that would mean 600 calories on a food label, during a gym session. We're asked to provide how many grams of ATP must be hydrolyzed to provide this amount of energy. So in other words, what the question is asking us when it says how many grams of ATP must be hydrolyzed, it's saying how much ATP must be converted into ADP and energy released in order to fuel this gym session, where the person is burning 600 kilocalories. Let's take down some key information here that we need in order to solve this problem. So in order to solve this problem, the key that we just looked at a moment ago was the extent to which the hydrolysis of ATP is exothermic. We said that when ATP is hydrolyzed, broken down into ADP and inorganic phosphate, that releases a total of 7.3 kilocalories per mole of ATP. So one key to solving this problem is realizing that 1 mole of ATP is the same thing as saying 7.3 kilocalories. This is our conversion factor, or one of the conversion factors that we need. The other thing that we need here is we need to know, since we're looking at grams of ATP, we need to know how moles of ATP relate to grams of ATP. And for that, we think back to our general chemistry and we use our molar mass. The molar mass of ATP, if we look that up, is 507 grams per mole, is the molecular weight of ATP. So I will go ahead and jot that down as well. That the molecular weight of ATP is 507 grams of ATP per mole of ATP. So in other words, 1 mole of ATP, or 507 grams of ATP, is equal to 7.3 kilocalories. Now, if we know that a person is burning 600 kilocalories during a gym session, it'd be wise for us to start with that. So I'm going to start with 600 kilocalories. And we know the relationship between kilocalories, moles of ATP, and grams. It's all listed for us up here by when we said that these three terms were equivalent. So if we have 600 kilocalories, then we can start using proportions of these two or three things here. So 600 kilocalories, and we want to know how many grams of ATP that corresponds to. Well, looking up here at our relationships, we saw that 7.3 kilocalories, so I will plug in 7.3 kilocalories in the denominator so that that cancels out with kilocalories in the numerator. And then 7.3 kilocalories is the same as saying 507 grams. We know those two factors are equivalent to one another because we said that 1 mole of ATP released 7.3 kilocalories of energy, and we said that 1 mole of ATP has 507 grams, so that's why we put that as all being equivalent. And so hence, we say 507 grams of ATP over 7.3 kilocalories generated by that. This is essentially saying that we're dividing 1 by 1 because these two factors are equivalent to one another. So checking out our math here, making sure that our numerators and denominators are set up correctly, kilocalories should cancel out here and here. It does, leaving us with our units being grams, which is what the question is asking for, is how many grams of ATP must be hydrolyzed to provide this energy. So going ahead and putting the equal sign here, doing some math, I believe tallies up to a grand total of 41,671 grams of ATP being used for a 600 kilocalorie workout. Imagine how much energy one would use, not for a 600 kilocalorie workout, but instead for running something like a whole marathon of several hours. Lots and lots of ATP, and this is how ATP ends up adding up to such a high number, equal to approximately one's body weight, being used over the course of a typical day. Now, to make sure that we are comfortable with conversion factors, we could also ask the question of, how many moles of ATP were used. So how many moles of ATP used? Keeping in mind that we're doing a 600 kilocalorie workout, so I'm going to go ahead and plug in 600 kcal again here at the beginning because that's what the problem tells us, that we are doing a 600 kilocalorie workout. We keep in mind again our central premise up top here, which was that we determined 1 mole of ATP always generates 7.3 kilocalories of energy, and the molecular weight of ATP is 507 grams per each mole, so hence 1 mole of ATP is the same as saying 507 grams. We use the appropriate conversion factor here, keeping in mind that 600 kilocalories is in the numerator, so we need to put in the denominator kilocalories of ATP. Looking up here, we saw that 7.3 kilocalories is the same as 1 mole. So I'm going to put into the numerator moles, so 1 mole. And hence we have this now set up once again so that our numerator here, kilocalories, cancels with the denominator here. And that leaves us with units of moles in the numerator as the units that we will find in our final solution here. Crunching the numbers there, taking 600 times 1 divided by 7.3 gives us a value of approximately 82 moles of ATP being used for this particular 600 kilocalorie workout. So with this example in mind, you should now be comfortable with taking any amount of calories from any type of activity and determining how many grams of ATP would be used to enable that process to take place, with the key conversion factor being what I've highlighted here in pink, that 1 mole of ATP will generate 7.3 kilocalories, which is the same as saying 507 grams of ATP being used. So since all of these are equivalent, they can all be put into ratios which will equal 1/1 in all of these different cases. So we set up the equation so that numerator and denominator cancels out in each case, and the numerator here on this portion of the equation represents whatever units you want your final answer to come out in. So you can follow this pattern each time and determine exactly how many grams of ATP are needed, how many moles are needed, or whatever the unknown is in this type of equation, you'll be ready, set to solve for it. And now that we've taken a close look at ATP, how that relates to calories and the generation of energy through breaking ATP into ADP, and then recycling that ADP back to ATP, we are now ready to take a look at some of the biochemical pathways that actually generate ATP through catabolism of food. We'll do that in the upcoming videos.